Hello. So, welcome to my Imagine Digital talk on art and design, making effective concept art for a game ready pipeline. My name is Baj Singh, and I'm just going to give you a brief introduction as to where I come from. So, I started in the games industry back in 2008 at a studio called Jagex. My first role in the industry was as a environment artist slash level designer on an unreleased project, unfortunately, called Stellar Dawn, which was a sci-fi kind of MMO, which was super awesome to work on, but unfortunately it didn't see the light of day. And then after that got cancelled, I moved over to RuneScape as a character artist and eventually progressed into a senior role there. And then in 2013, I made the jump over to Creative Assembly to work on Total War Battles Kingdom, which was their kind of mobile game at the time. It was also on Steam as well, I believe. Purely as mainly as a principal character artist, but I also did some things like lighting, some environment assets, and some kind of post effects. And once that wrapped up, I moved over to the Total War Warhammer franchise as a lead character artist, and I've been there ever since for a good 5 years or so. And now I am the project art director on the Total War Warhammer franchise. So yeah, just a brief kind of starting point. Um, there is an expectation for what concept art looks like. I think this is probably because of how concept art or most art is portrayed on ArtStation. It's very polished. You've got very highly rendered, lots of things going on, insane kind of perspective on the characters. And this is what people think they have to achieve if they want to be a concept artist. But this is actually marketing art. You'll very rarely see something like this used as concept art. This is something that will either be maybe on a box, or it'll be used in promotional materials, or it'll be used by, generally used by a marketing team to advertise the game. Sometimes it might be used in game as like as a 2D narrative element, but this is very rarely used as concept art. In reality, this is more what concept art is, and I think concept art is a bit of a deceptive term. I think a better term would be concept design, because that's what the intention is. So if you look at a lot of this work here, you can see that there's a lot of kind of different angles, front angle, side angle, quite a few breakdowns, material reference, and generally, in terms of polish, it's not super polished at all, but that's not the function of this art. It's there to be a design for another team, such as a 3D artist, 3D art team, or an animation team, or a technical team, to kind of take this and apply it to their discipline. And there are quite a few types of concept art. I'll cover a few here, but there's more. There's definitely more in the industry, depending on where you work on. So yeah, so you've got mood paintings here. Now these can be done very quickly. They are almost thumbnail sized in comparison to like a fully fledged piece of, say, marketing art. Um, Not a lot of detail will go into them. They're usually done in grayscale with some color applied afterwards. But the goal of them, the aim of them, is to set the tone of the piece, set the tone of, say, in our case, a race that we might introduce in a DLC, or some sort of story element which we might want the player to kind of follow, or some sort of narrative element. It's almost like storyboarding in a way, but just with a bit more detail. But what it does is it definitely helps set the mood and tone for what we want to achieve, whether it be for a brand new race that we want to introduce, or for a brand new, like I said, story, narrative, something like that. It could even be used as a base for marketing art. Let's say if one of the marketing team wanted to take one of these views and really liked it and wanted to polish it, they could send this to an illustrator and use it as reference. Style guide. Now, this one is incredibly important. The style guide sets the tone for everything. It's kind of like, these are the rules you must follow in order to achieve the look for this race. And these are not necessarily the constraints. I think constraints is probably the wrong word, but these are the guidelines that you want to follow in order to get a look set for a specific race. In this case, the Tomb Kings. So you can see here our concept artist has taken, very basic primary shapes, and said, and these are the kind of shapes that you'd expect to see within this race. And it's not just shape language; it's also materials. For example, if you know a race uses a lot of bone or a lot of iron or a lot of brass, you can outline them clearly in the style guide. And what that does is it gives the concept artist, whoever's doing the final concept art for the assets, a kind of direction to go in. So they don't just go in every single direction and start applying whatever they can, because then you end up with a real mishmash of designs, which might, from a design point of view, be interesting, but if it doesn't satisfy the criteria for what that race should be, or what that story element should be, or what the design element should be from the actual design team, not the visual team, but the kind of gameplay team, then it's not doing its job. And then finally, you have the actual concept design. This is where the concept artists will spend most of their time, because these are usually on an asset by asset basis. In this example, this is just one of the empire buildings that was used in Warhammer 1, but you can see quite clearly here it's not overly rendered. It's just mainly line art with some shadow information and some lighting information. But it's built specifically and it's designed specifically for an environment artist or a building artist to take this and kind of take it apart and know how to construct it. So it's a lot more focused on the function of the art and design rather than making it super pretty. And by super pretty, I mean overly rendered, rendering every material, such as the slates on the roof or the kind of wood paneling or the stone on the side. It's there purely for functional terms. And now there are different approaches and styles to concept art. You'll usually find a concept art team will consist of quite a few people. In our case, on the character side specifically, we have 2 or 3 concept artists, and they all have a radically different style. But that's the purpose of the style guide. The style guide outlines how the character should look in game. So if the concept artists approach the same race in a completely different way because they draw in their own style, um, the 3D team can still take that and translate it into an asset with a consistent look with everything within that race. So just as an example, I'll show you 4 different pieces of concept art for the same race. So this one was done by Reinhardt for Warhammer 1, and you can see he uses quite a rendered approach, where he's painted this in grayscale initially and then just applied color to it. And he's kind of got all the muscles and things defined, a lot of the folds in the fabric defined in the leather. And yeah, that's the approach that he takes with his art generally. And then you have Theo, who went for a more stylized approach. This is a lot flatter, a lot more focused on line art rather than having a lot of rendered elements, and just two-tone shading, just to keep it simple and straightforward. And then you have Rich, who's incredibly stylized with his work. As you can see here, there's almost no renderings. It's all just completely flat. And the line art kind of takes care of most of the depth. He's got one rendered view here, but that's it. That's as far as he goes with it. And then you have Tony here, who's kind of like a mishmash. He's got a very stylized, cartoony approach to his work with some rendering, but not much. It's very, compared to Reinhardt's, where he's got all the muscles rendered out. He's just got the basic forms rendered out. There's an expectation here again for the character artist to understand how anatomy works. So he doesn't need to go in and render out the triceps to an incredibly detailed level. The character artist can take care of that. But as you can see, all 4 of these belong to the same race. They're all part of the Greenskins race, but the character artist can work from the style guide and make sure that all of these characters, once they've been sculpted and detailed up and the materials applied, will all look consistent. They won't look as though they're kind of disparate characters. They will all look as though they're part of the same race. And you can see the same thing here. There's different approaches. You don't just have to do things in 2D. I think there's a general misconception that to be a concept artist, you have to be the best 2D artist. That's not the case. Ultimately, a concept is a design. It's there for someone else to work from. Your art is not going to go into the game, the concept art itself. I mean, there might be cases where, in this case, a 3D base is made, and this is made by Jim, one of our 2D, one of our environment concept artists, but he does a lot of his work in 3D as a base, just because this helps him with his perspective, this helps him with his form. He can take this and he can throw it into the game quickly to see how it works with everything else in that environment. And then once he's happy with it, he can do a paint over like this. This is a different ship. I couldn't actually find the original ship, rendered up. So you'll have to just imagine that this one is that ship. And he took this and he drew it up and added some more information for the environment artist to work from. And then they can either take this base, use it as kind of like a proportional guideline and build around it, or they can just start from scratch. But I think that the aim of this is to show you that when it comes to concept art is very flexible. It is, and again, concept design is very flexible. Whatever tool set you use is entirely up to you. It's whatever gets the job done, and that job is conveying your design to the team who have to build it or work from it. That is the most important thing. And it doesn't matter whether you do that in Photoshop, whether you do it in a 3D, 3D software, whether you do it in ZBrush. Ultimately, that is your goal, and to do it quickly. I think that's the other key thing to bring up is speed is a big thing. Um, Typically, on our team, a concept artist might spend on a character between 4 and 5 days doing a full character, and that sometimes includes variants. And then the character artist, the 3D character artist, will spend 5 times, 6 times that making it. So speed is a big thing. Key elements of concept design. So yeah, so I'm just going to quickly go over these now, and then I'll detail it out. So we have thumbnails and exploration. We have breakdowns and functionality. And we have reference and materials. So just to start off, thumbnails and exploration. So this, whenever we develop a new DLC or we have a new race for Warhammer, what we'll do is the concept artist will take all the information they can regarding the units of that race. So like gender, age. They'll take the miniatures as a reference. That's super important on the Warhammer side, just because the miniatures are there to provide a lot of that reference work for you or for the artist, and even what weapons they use and which hand they hold that weapon in and how many hands they use to hold it, whether it's a one-handed weapon or two-handed weapon. They take as much information as they can get to develop these thumbnails, the better. And these thumbnails will just set a guideline for the race, and they'll be used by pretty much every discipline, because it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a technical animator, an animator, environment artist, character artist, designer. You can take a look at these and understand the theme and the personality behind every single character belonging to this race. You can see the scale, you can see how big they are. So if you look here at the idol here, you can see this little man here. And these are all kind of relative in terms of size. So all of this information is super useful across discipline, not just the character team. But you'll generally do this at the start of a Warhammer project just to get a feel for how everything's going to look. It's not the final concept, it's just there to outline an initial look. And the big focus here is silhouette, because most of our game is played at quite a distance. Players hardly ever get close to the characters. They're always playing quite zoomed out. So what we want to do is ensure that we have maximum readability and kind of uniqueness for each character based upon there being a distance. And you can kind of see that here. So silhouette is a big thing. Take your character, make it grayscale or make it black, and just see how each of these forms relates to each other. How the sword shape works, how the kind of feathers on their head work. All of that needs to be taken into account. And then material and contrast. So making sure that the material colors are different enough, making sure that there's enough contrast there. Generally, we keep the legs or the bottom part of the legs, in this case, because he's the legendary lord, he's got a bit more detail, but we generally keep it quite low detail, or kind of uninteresting, because most of the interest should be up here. And the goal of the concept artist is to make sure that they can lead the eye of the player or the viewer from the uninteresting parts and make it flow into the interesting parts, which 99% of the time is the face and head area, and the shoulders as well. And then, on to breakdowns and functionality. So for that character that we just saw, what I would say is one of the big things people forget is that in most video games, you don't see the character from the front, you see them from the back. A third-person game, RTS game in our case, you're always looking at the characters running from the back view. So the back view is just as important as the front view, and a lot of people forget to draw the back view. And from a 3D artist point of view, that's not great, because if you've got the front view, that's awesome, but you need to know what's going on here. So in this case, the concept artist took the back view, and then they also added the cape onto it as well, because his character wears a cape. So you definitely want to make sure that you provide enough information for your 3D artist to work from. Otherwise, yeah, they're just going to be struggling to figure out how your design works, especially if you've only rendered it in one view and not the other. Um, Line art, super important. So if you've got some elements such as these, where it's unclear as to how it works, they need to be kind of addressed and outlined on the concept. So very simple line art doesn't need to be rendered. You don't have to go crazy with it. Ultimately, it's just there to show the 3D artist how, or even an animator, how this would function in game. This is a good example actually because this concept doesn't work, um, and it's a good example of what we had to do when it didn't work. What happened was we realized this later when we started modeling it, because what should happen is if you see this point here on the yoke where my mouse is, in game, that should rotate like this, left and right. Now, built like that, it can't rotate left and right at all. So there is a revision of this concept. I don't have it at hand, unfortunately, where this wooden section, instead of stopping here, goes down and under, and it goes under the chariot, and this rivet here is added underneath, so it can actually rotate from a pivot. So that's a good example of where design went wrong, but it was caught later on by me and the artist who was making it, and we just quickly redesigned it. So the importance of functionality in design, you need to make sure that it works, because if it doesn't, you're going to have trouble. And it's always worth getting other people's eyes on this. What we do with a concept is we will get the technical animators to have a look at it, and even the regular animators, because we want to make sure that it would work. So the technical animators are responsible for creating the rigs, the skeletons, and then the animators obviously make it move. So you want to make sure that you show it to both of them, and then they can go, well, actually, that section here could have this joint, or you could move this joint down here, so it would pivot better. So there's a lot of people who are involved in that process, not just the character artists. And variants are super important. So for a lot of our units, especially like core units in game, they might share elements of the body, but they'll have areas that are modular where you want to be able to swap bits of parts in and out. So the concept artist will design things such as the helmet, where they can take some of these variants and take parts off, almost like Lego, switch parts in and out to quickly create additional variations, and that way it saves the character artist time. Because the last thing you want to do is have every single one of these variants be completely unique, just because that will cost the character artist more time to make it, and it's not necessarily worth it. It's like if you can get quick and cheap variation through modularity, that's a bonus. And then, yeah, just back to this one here. Again, similar design to this, but breakdowns from different angles for parts that might be a bit difficult to kind of read. So in this case, it's this kind of section here. Um, the concept artist took it and drew it from several different angles just to make sure that the 3D artist understood how this functions. And this kind of, the way this functions is this pivot can kind of come in and out. And this part here, you can't see my finger on the screen, but you can see my mouse. This section here will bend, so this whole kind of wheel at the front is almost like some weird lawnmower effect. Uh, yeah, spells. So I don't think most people realize that what we do is we also concept spells for the game. The VFX team are super important and critical in this section, and they need to know how a spell's going to work so they can visualize it and kind of create those VFX elements. So what our concept artists will do is they will take the kind of almost like storyboard in a spell. And you can see here, it's very simple kind of effects. This smoke is literally just a brush that's just been splattered on to show what the effect should be. But you can see here all the different steps have been outlined, from the area of effect being selected by the player to the orb kind of building up. And all of these steps have just been outlined quickly in Photoshop. And then the VFX artist can look at it and go, okay, I know what I need to do to build this up, and I know what I need to do to kind of make this work. Obviously, things like timing and all that sort of stuff will have to be part of a bigger discussion with the designers, the gameplay designers. But what this highlights is that there's a lot of people involved in this process. It's not just draw this, okay, now pass it on to someone else. It's like the concept artist will physically have to speak to the VFX artists and the designers, and they'll get together and discuss this at length before any 2D work's done. And then the 2D work gets done. They'll come over again, have a look, see if it works. In theory, if they see any issues, there'll be some redesigns, and then it gets made. And that that might get made 2 or 3 times depending on whether or not it actually works. So yeah, there's a lot of trial and error and iteration there. And finally, reference and materials. So this is one of the things I was talking about when it comes to rendering and overly rendering your concept. Is a lot of the time when it comes to referencing materials such as this brass on his gauntlet or the fabric on his cape, there's no point rendering every single element of it because we've already got assets that are done, or we've already got reference materials, or you can go to the internet and you can download similar materials or pictures of materials and literally just put them on the concept and add a color guide and go, look, this is what color this bandage should be. This is how much detail and grime it should have. If you look at the bandage on here, there's no rendering whatsoever. It's almost flat with maybe a tiny bit of like a cloudy effect, but the 3D artist knows what it should look like based on the reference pics on the side. And it goes back to saving time. You want to save time and make sure that the most important elements of the concept design are highlighted, and the rendering isn't that important. Like rendering your concept to a really polished state, nope. Making sure your design's functional and interesting, yes, that is the most important part, and done fast and done quick. Speed is a key thing. And same thing here. So you can see on this concept, there's zero lighting information whatsoever, with the exception of the really kind of like the line art defining the depth and thickness of elements. But what we've done here is we've got a library of materials that we use, and that was built by one of our 3D artists. In fact, I think I built that. And basically, the 2D artist can just take that library, copy and paste it onto the concept. So you can see here, you know, they've just put a little thumb here that you can go, okay, this is gold, this is steel, this is like a schisty material, and then this is terracotta. And all the 3D artist has to do in their software package is take that material and drag it onto the character on that section. Done. There'll be some refining, obviously, to make sure that the effect looks good, but that's all it takes. And it's a massive time saver. So something to think about is if you know that your 3D team has a material library, take advantage of it because it will help them out in the long term. Yeah, communication skills, big one. I don't think this gets covered enough. When I'm hiring an artist or artists, it's not just how good they are at their job. Obviously, they've got to be fairly skilled, but a big thing that I look for is personality and team fit. I'd say that's almost 50% of the hiring process. It's how well they would fit within that team and how good they are at communicating with other people. Because if I've got an artist who just works in a bubble and can't communicate their wants, needs, or take into account other people's wants and needs, especially as it's a fairly collaborative process, it's very, very difficult to work with them. And it's, again, we're not saying you need to be the most extroverted, talkative, loudest, chattiest person there, but you've got to know how to speak to people. It is a team environment, and you are not just an artist. You're a game developer first and foremost. The team comes first. Your kind of bias towards your own work is should be far off in the distance. That's not important at all. Like personal work, sure, that's a different thing altogether. But when it comes to working in a professional environment, you want to make sure that you work collaboratively with your team. So just some examples here of where teamwork is important. You can see here on these shoulder pads that the shoulder pad itself is quite big, quite chunky. Now, if you were designing this, you might think that shoulder pad would go into his head if he lifted his arms up too high, or if he started to do this. But if you speak to, say, the technical animators, you'll know that these shoulder pads have their own bone in them. And I actually, unfortunately, showed you this a bit too early. But they have a bone in here, which means that they can control the shoulder pad independently of the arm. So if they do this with the arm, they can take the shoulder pad and make it come down so they can avoid it clipping with the head. So you've got a lot more freedom of movement there, but you might not know that unless you actually speak to the technical animator in question. So that's why it's kind of super important to make sure that you are speaking to people, because you might restrict yourself too much, which won't help you at all. Same deal here with the character team. So you can see on this concept, there's a lot of elements which are reused. So if you look at the yellow parts, these parts here are reused across pretty much all the characters, all the variants of this character. The unique parts are the cowl, the heads, and some of these elements on the shoulders, even the arms and the legs. They're kind of reused and flipped and mirrored. The reason for this is that, again, the critical elements of the character, the bit where most of the players will be spending their time focused on, is the head and the shoulders. The actual body itself doesn't get that much of a look in. So you can get away with reusing a lot of these elements and mirroring or kind of flipping parts where you want to reuse them. So this arm here, the character artist could build this arm, and then they could take it and then they could mirror it over and use it on the other side, so it could be used as a left or right arm. And that way you get a lot more kind of variation created cheaply. And that is the key thing, because it's not just about how quickly you can create the variation, but also reducing the amount of their unique parts to maximize variation. Because for the character artists, they've got to think of things like texture space, because all of these elements will be saved on the same texture, and the more elements or the more unique elements you've got on there, the more texture space gets used, and the lower fidelity the character will look, because there's less texture space to accommodate for all of those unique parts. So it's super important to think about that. And that, again, is a discussion with the character artists. And ideally, that it's in the style guide as well. There'll be some sort of rule set there saying, hey, make a couple of unique faces, or make a couple of unique kind of the word for them, shoulder pads, cowls. I think cowls probably the better word. Make a couple of these unique areas, and then that way the rest of it can kind of be repurposed within the character. But you wouldn't know that unless you spoke to the character artist. And you can see here, that's what the final asset looks like. So you can see even on the legs down here, it's the same leg just flipped left and right. But because the legs aren't a focus, you'll never see that. You'll never notice that in game. Same with this leg here, left and right, it's the same one. On this version, they've just taken the left leg here and the right leg here and just reused it. And then even stuff like this fabric here has just been flipped to use on the other side. Because again, if you're not looking at the character head on, but if you're looking at it from an angle, you'll see one character with this fabric on and another one without the fabric on, because you're looking at it, let's say, from the left side. So all of that stuff needs to be taken into account. But because you're focused mainly on the top of the character, you can see they look fairly unique. Another one, I haven't got it outlined here, but I think the best example, the old-fashioned example, is tentacles. And it's one we always used to use. It's like a concept art is putting 50 tentacles on a creature, and then the animator looking at it and just dying inside, because they're like, we can't animate all of these tentacles. They're all going to clip with each other, or we just don't have the budget to do it. And again, that would require a discussion with the animator and even the character artist, because the character artist will look at it and go, I don't know how I'm supposed to model 50 tentacles within my texture budget or my polygon budget. So yes, can't highlight this enough. All the other skills that I've mentioned in terms of concept art, they all pretty much equal communication skills. Like, they're all on par in terms of importance. This is super important, and I can't stress that enough. Yes, you might be introverted, but it's not an excuse to not be able to communicate with your team. That is vital and super important, and it's a skill that I think you should also be learning to develop alongside your concept art skills. And if that means working in smaller projects outside of work, where you might work with a 3D character artist and work together on something as a personal piece, great. Feedback in Discord groups, fantastic. Like, you're working with other people. Feedback, again, is a skill that needs to be worked on, but that's a discussion for another time. But yeah, can't stress that enough. Communication skills, super important. And yeah, just a couple of resources that might help you out on your journey. So a really good one is the Riot Games So You Want to Make Games video series. They've got a video on concept art. You can just go to YouTube and just do a search for So You Want to Make Games. But they've also got a video on character art, environment art, technical art, VFX. And I would say watch them all. watch them all because you'll get an incredible understanding. Well, not an incredible understanding. You'll get a very, very good understanding of what all the other teams and disciplines have to go through, and you will spend a lot of time working with those teams and disciplines. So it's good that you know the basics of what they kind of their jobs entail. The Dota 2 Workshop Character Art Guide. Again, you can just do a search for Character Art Guide Dota 2 Workshop. Really good. Really good for showing you color breakup, complementary colors, color mixing, gradienting, and silhouette. From a character point of view, it's an invaluable resource, and I strongly recommend you read it through a couple of times. One of my articles. So again, you can just do a Google search for what makes concept useful from concept art useful from a 3D character artist point of view. Excuse the typo. And you should find this. It's got a lot of elements from this talk in there. It's probably elaborated a bit more, and obviously it's nice to have that down in text form. But that should provide, prove quite useful in terms of showing you how we work on the Warhammer side and how we deal with things. And finally, Feng Shui Design, School of Design, one of the best resources out there for concept art. He covers pretty much everything, and he's been making videos for years, and I can't stress this enough. If you want really good concept art advice, or just watching him paint, FZD School of Design on YouTube. I think he has a website as well. Check it out. Worth your time. And that's it. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. You can find me on Twitter at @badge_sing, and you can also find me at ArtStation at artstation.com/badge_sing. Feel free to send me a message if you want. I'm, again, usually quite busy, so I might not get through to all of them. And if I don't take it personally. I apologize. But yes, thank you very much. And I hope this talk was super useful. And yes, and all the other talks as well. They should all be fantastic. So thank you for your time. Take care.